So let's finally get into working with SharePoint Designer. Now, I have a SharePoint site here. This is a regular SharePoint 2010 team site, the one I've been using all along. It's on my own SharePoint server. Now, I already know that I have a lot of options under my Site Actions menu. And I have all these because I'm a site collection administrator of this site collection. And that's a really good permission level to have when customizing SharePoint sites. SharePoint does care deeply about permissions, whether you're in the browser or whether you're in SharePoint Designer. Now, we know that we get to any SharePoint site in a web browser by typing in a URL, and that will be the same for SharePoint Designer. That's how we know what site to go to. So we need the address of the site. But as you probably know, SharePoint site URLs can get pretty long. The simplest way to find the address of the current site without all the extra library and page URLs is just hover over the top level breadcrumb here, the title of the site. And down at the bottom left on the status bar, I'll see the shortest address for this site, which for me is ldcsharepoint.com/sites/team. That's my own SharePoint server. So I'm going to copy that address because I'll use it in a moment. Now, actually, if I'm already in the website in the web browser and I want to open this in SharePoint Designer, I could just go to my Site Actions menu and say Edit in SharePoint Designer. But let's say I wasn't in the browser. I want to do this manually. What I'm going to do is open SharePoint Designer. I do have it installed already. Typically, it's installed under a SharePoint category here, although I've actually pinned it to my Start menu. So I'm just going to launch it. Now, if you were using SharePoint Designer 2007, you'll know that it could be used almost as a conventional web design tool. You could make regular web pages, even regular conventional websites in it. This is no longer true. With the 2010 version of SharePoint Designer, we don't have those options to make regular websites or individual pages. The unit that we work with here is a SharePoint site. In fact, I can even create a new SharePoint site directly from SharePoint Designer. Here I've got options here for a new blank website or adding a subsite. I see some of the common templates like blog and team site. But most of the time we'll work with existing sites. Now, after you've opened sites in SharePoint Designer, they'll appear over here in the recent sites area as bookmarks, but I don't have any listed. So I'm going to click Open Site. And all I'm going to do down here for site name is just paste in the address of the site I want to go to, and then click Open. SharePoint Designer takes a few seconds to talk to SharePoint to get information about the site, and then it will open it up in the SharePoint Designer program. Now, if you need to provide a username and password when you're viewing the site in the browser, you'll almost certainly need to provide a username and password when opening it in SharePoint Designer. My system's configured to pass those credentials automatically, so it's not asking me for authorization here. And here's an important concept. Having SharePoint Designer does not magically give you any permissions you didn't already have. If you couldn't access this site in a web browser, you won't be able to access it using SharePoint Designer. If you can't make changes to it in a web browser because you don't have the right permissions, you won't suddenly have better permissions when using SharePoint Designer. So if you need to have those permissions elevated, contact whoever gave you access to the site in the first place. So we're in SharePoint Designer 2010. Now, if you've used SharePoint Designer 2007, you'll immediately see that while this might have the same name, it's a very different application. In the past, SharePoint Designer 2007 would open up almost pretending that your SharePoint site was a regular website of folders and files. But now with SharePoint Designer 2010, this really does feel like a SharePoint-focused program, not a web design application. It doesn't show you some fake representation of your site, something you might see in Dreamweaver or another web design program. It tells you what this site is made of. This section over here on the left under the word navigation, this shows you the building blocks that your SharePoint site is created of, the lists and libraries in this site. I can click lists and libraries, see my lists, see my libraries, the workflows. I don't have any custom workflows here, but if I had, I'd see them here. Site pages, the wiki pages that I've created myself or the web part pages, any site assets that I have or content types. And clicking the home icon at the top will take us to the top level information and settings of this site. And you'll also see that as I click around, the ribbon for SharePoint Designer changes. If I'm in the Lists and Libraries section, I have options to make a new SharePoint list, a new document library, create a new list from a spreadsheet. If I've clicked on the Home icon, I'll instead see things like the ability to add users and groups to create a subsite. Now, a lot of these options will actually just take us back to the web browser. If, for example, I come over here and I click this option to go to the administration web page, it's just going to open up a web browser to take me to the same page I'd get by hitting Site Actions, Site Settings. In a similar fashion, if I hit the Recycle Bin option, it's going to take me to the Recycle Bin section of that website. But there are a lot of things we can only do in SharePoint Designer. Now, if you're coming from SharePoint Designer 2007, the closest thing to what you're familiar with, you can get by clicking this All Files folder here. This gives you a kind of top-down folder-style view of the structure of your SharePoint site and the containers inside it. It gives you folders that represent, say, your site pages library and your shared documents library. Now, we might use this view from time to time, but I only use the All Files view when there's no other option. It's much friendlier going through the very specific options above it, going directly into the Lists and Libraries section and being able to drop into a particular list or library, going directly into the Site Pages section and making a new page here. Now, we're going to get a lot deeper into SharePoint Designer as we go forward, but we're now connected to a SharePoint site. And this is what we're going to use to do more significant customization of our pages. And it will allow us to start creating overall site designs instead of just affecting individual pages one at a time.